is Scott Rasmussen is joining us on Fridays, even after July 4th. He's a workaholic because he's got the best polling in America. And this segment is brought to you by the Job Creators Network. And Scott Rasmussen with us now from scottrasmussen.com. You got to make sure that is in your key every day. First thing I do when I go up, I go to scottrasmussen.com. I get his number of the day. I get his new polling. Keeps me abreast of what is going on. Scott, great to have you, man.
Good to be with you, John. Happy 4th.
Happy 4th also. Now, we're going to get into your polls and politics and all that, but what did you think of the president's salute to Independence Day yesterday?
You know, this from a polling and an analytical perspective, it's one of those events that what you see depends exactly on what you expected to see going in. People that hate the president will see it as a terrible thing and a violation of our traditions, a threat to the individuals, I heard some say. People who like the president say it was totally appropriate and it was a moving tribute. And that's where we are as a country right now.
Wow. So basically, if you support the president, you liked it. If you didn't support the president, you don't like it.
Right.
Unbelievable.
And, you know, it is really unfortunate that's where our political system is, but there's no denying it.
Okay, so let's get to some of your polling numbers. Here's one that shocked me. You always have a shock poll. Not that you do that on purpose. It's a Scott shock poll. So we all saw the debates last week, and of course we made fun of I said, people asked me who the winner was, Scott, all week, and I said, as I told you last week, Karl Marx. So you did a poll, and it comes out 48% favor busing to increase integration of public schools. Now, if you asked me ahead of time what I thought that would be, I would have said it was be about 15%. Almost 50% favor busing. Scott, I grew up in that era. My parents pulled me out of public schools not to get bused and paid for a private school, and we were didn't have a lot of money. We were, just the tip of middle class at best. Both my parents worked 2 jobs, and so they pulled me out because they didn't want to get bused. And I didn't know anybody that liked it, black or white, but 48% favor it, according to your recent poll.
Well, and that's because there is a huge generational divide. Among younger voters, people under 50, most think it's a good idea, 61%. Older voters, people over 50, people of your generation, people of your parents' era, 65% are opposed to it. And, perhaps it's because it was a real thing to a generation or two ago, and it's just a theory right now. Perhaps it's because of changing priorities. But this is something where there is as big a generation gap as you're going to see in any issue.
So you favor it if you didn't go through it.
That's one way to put it, yes. And look, there's other issues involved, other dynamics too. 59% of Democrats favor it, 67% of black voters favor it. So what that means is that when Kamala Harris brought that up with Joe Biden, she was not only bringing up an issue that the progressive activist base of the Democratic Party felt Joe Biden was wrong on. Most Democrats right now would agree with her position on this, and that has big implications as we go forward.
Unbelievable. We're with Scott Rasmussen. ScottRasmussen.com is where you want to go. This segment brought to you by the Job Creators Network. Another poll you've got out, despite every candidate on stage during the debates, a second night of the debate, raising their hand in support of providing health insurance to illegal aliens, illegal immigrants. New polling from the Job Creators Network, Scott Rasmussen Weekly Pulse, reveals that only 27% of Americans believe that to be true. So, they don't even believe what the Democrats are saying. What? Explain that one.
Look, this is one of those moments where people who are involved in the political world have to draw back and recognize only 10% of Americans said they watched, the whole thing, both debates. The knowledge of what was said is not something instantly translated into public knowledge. We put a range of options for people. Do you think all of the leading Democrats said this, most, et cetera? Only 61% believe that most of the leading Democrats support a $15 minimum wage. Only 45% believe that most of the leading Democratic nominees want to get rid of private health insurance. Only 47% believe that they want to have a 70% tax rate on upper-income Americans. And one of the kind of interesting quirks in the data is that Republicans have a better understanding of the Democratic nominees' positions than Democratic and independent voters. And I'm sure that's because someone like you sees this debate and you say, that's a ridiculous position. How can anybody support that? Whereas a lot of people on the political left are looking at those things and it doesn't strike them as odd, so it's not highlighted as much.
How big, just looking at the polling numbers, Scott Rasmussen, the fact when we reflected on this debate, a lot of us said, okay, the Democrats are cooked here because they're all for open borders and then they're for giving illegal aliens health care, and we can't even get health care for millions of Americans now, and now we're going to give it to illegals, and we're going to make another incentive for them to come in. Mainstream America, that's never going to fly. As you're doing these polling, are you seeing that, or is there just an indifference there, Scott Rasmussen?
Well, you're right in terms of the public opinion on these issues. Only 26% think that subsidies should be provided for illegal immigrants. Only 18% think that private health insurance companies should be banned. The idea of having open borders has never been popular. In fact, you and I have talked on the show before. 8 out of 10 people think that legal immigration is good. 8 out of 10 think that illegal immigration is bad. So you have these issues. Right now, it's way early in the game for most voters, especially for the swing voters who are ultimately going to be the decision makers a year from November. I would expect that if the Democratic nominee comes from the pool that we see and is embracing these positions, that Donald Trump will make sure that every American knows those positions, and that's what his campaign should do. And it's a big problem for the Democrats. Some describe it as moving too far to the left, some perhaps just too aggressive, but whatever it is, these are positions that are going to come back to haunt some of the Democratic candidates, not just for president, but for other offices as well.
You're on the John Fredericks Radio Network, trucking the truth across America. My friends, your Godzilla of the truth. I'm live at Virginia Tech today in Blacksburg, steep in Southwest Virginia. A lot of baseball going on here. Scott, let's get to the poll bump, right? So we looked at the debates, and everybody assumed that the biggest winner of the next polling would be Kamala Harris because she took on Joe Biden, and of course the lamestring, the legacy media loved it. She got a tremendous amount of play. It was on all the news shows over and over and over again. Yet Scott Rasmussen poll comes out, and the biggest bounces were Warren and Castro from the first debate night. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, Warren and Castro had the first debate night. It went well because, and bluntly, they didn't have a lot of big top-tier competition in that evening, so they did get some benefits. But when you looked at the two debates together, Kamala Harris was the biggest winner. She went from 6% in our polling all the way up to 13%. She's essentially tied with Bernie Sanders for second place. Lots of encouraging things in the numbers for her. However, when you look overall, the question, I guess, for her is, and really for the entire Democratic Party, is this something? Is she going to be the lasting challenge to Joe Biden, or is this going to be like when the Republicans took on Mitt Romney in 2012, and the base wasn't happy with the front runners, but after every debate, Newt Gingrich was up on top one time, and somebody else would be up on top the next time, and none of them could sustain it. That's what we're going to watch for. Joe Biden, despite the fact that he took a hit, still has the highest favorability ratings of any Democratic hopeful, both in the general public and among Democrats. There is a sense that there's a little less support for him than before. Right now, 75% of Democratic voters say they would be satisfied or excited with Biden and their nominee as their nominee, and that's down 10 points from a month or so ago. Harris and Warren are both in that category. More than 70% say yeah, we'd be okay with them as the nominee. So I think it's fair to say that Harris did get a big win. Warren improved their position a little bit. Bernie Sanders certainly looking a little bit weaker right now, and Joe Biden a little bit weaker.
So, Scott Rasmussen, what great insight going back to 2012. By the way, you got to follow him. Go to scottrasmussen.com. Sign up for his newsletter. You can sign up right there. Get it every day. Get his number of the day, scottrasmussen.com. Plus, read his book. I haven't finished it, Scott. I did start reading it, and then I got busy, but it's with me on this trip to Blacksburg. It's called The Sun is Still Rising. Very optimistic, upbeat book. Read it. Check it out. Go to scottrasmussen.com. Scott, great analogy in 2012. I hadn't thought of that. That's why we love having you on. I hadn't thought of that. Base not happy with Romney like me. I wanted nothing to do with him. I was for Newt. But during that campaign, it was like first Herman Cain was ahead. Then he imploded.
Right.
Then Newt Gingrich got ahead. I remember when Gingrich got ahead, and he got ahead substantially. And I remember it was like in December, and I remember being there with the campaign, covering it, and Gingrich said in December, I'm going to be the nominee. That's when this polling came out. And of course, then he crashed shortly after that. I'm going to be the nominee. And then Santorum caught up to Romney. So they kept having these different front runners. All of them imploded, and Romney winning easily. So that is a great analogy. That same thing could happen. Now, with all this
and by the way,
going on,
and the reason for it is very similar. And by Rudy Giuliani also was a little bit of a Joe Biden character in 2008.
That's
but
right.
These people were out of sync with their base. Joe Biden, does have support among the more moderate Democrats, but he is out of sync with the party's base. And when you have a party that is as young and diverse and angry as the Democrats are today, Joe Biden is just not the character that you associate with them. Whether he can survive that or not remains to be seen.
It's going to be interesting. Great analysis, as always, by Scott Rasmussen. Okay, Scott, so let's go to the citizenship question, which the Supreme Court shot down last week. On the census, the Trump administration, through the Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, wanting to put a question on that says, are you a citizen of the United States? So you put 73% believe that that's an appropriate question. Sure. I mean, one would think that you want to take a census of the people that are here, citizens of the country, not people that came in the country illegally, yet you can't. They can't get it done. I mean, the president, even with 73%, he can't get it done.
Well,
Explain that
there's a lot of popular things that you can't get done. More than 70% support term limits as well, and we do encounter resistance to public opinion lots of times. In this case, this is the reason the president clarified that he's going to continue to fight for this. This is an issue that if the president loses on this debate, it is likely to fire up Republicans in a lot of ways, and especially their intensity once again about who will be making Supreme Court appointments. This is an issue that, for whatever reason, it's kind of like immigration overall, in the sense that the president has tapped into a very core feeling among the country, and a lot of people across the aisle, and quite frankly, many in official Washington just aren't getting it. They aren't seeing the public frustration on these topics.
Last one, Scott Rasmussen. Your presidential poll, you've got Biden 41%, Trump 40%, and then Trump ahead of Sanders 40-39. So he's staying at 40%. Other polling has been showing Biden up by 15 or 18. Why do you only have him up by 1?
Well, first of all, before
Other than
all
you're
of
better than
the turmoil of the last few weeks, we had him up by 7 to 9 points typically, so he's lost a little support. But the biggest difference between our polling and many of the others that you cite right now is that we are giving people the option to say they're not sure, or they would vote for a third-party candidate. And, it is unfair to, or not unfair, it doesn't strike us as reasonable to, if somebody's not really paying attention and they're not really hooked on any of the candidates, to say, okay, but you have to decide right now. It's either Trump or Biden We're not going to let you have any other options. And I think the reason this is so important is that gives us a sense. There's about 20% of the population that some of them won't end up voting. Some of them are leaning one way or the other, but they haven't decided just yet. There's a reason we have campaigns. There's a reason we have these debates, and it's because not everybody has made up their mind a year and a half in advance. Long time ago, back probably when you and I were in preschool era, there was a theory among political scientists. The people who waited to the last minute were those who were most engaged in politics. They were the ones who would study the issues and not decide if they walked into the ballot box. What we've learned throughout my lifetime is that the people who are most engaged in politics make their decision the earliest. They stick to their candidate. They are fired up. And the people who are ultimately the swing voters are not going to be tuning in to this campaign until a year from September at the earliest.
Wow. So we got a long way to go, basically. So you have the committeds, and then you have the swing voters that make up their mind in the final weeks.
Yep.
All right. One last thing. Your Scott Rasmussen's number of the day, 31%. This is another shocker, and it's going to a little bit feed into the Democrats' narrative. Explain your 31%, Scott.
Well, 31% of full-time workers work on weekends, on an average weekend day. Now, for some, that might just be their regular shift. They work a Tuesday through Saturday shift. For some, it means they're putting in extra hours beyond the 5-day work week. The shifts tend to be a little bit shorter on the weekends, and not surprisingly, people who work more than one job are more likely to have a weekend shift than those that don't. But yes, this is an important thing. We grew up in a time when there was a certain work shift that you expected to have. It's not quite that simple anymore. And when a third of the workers are showing up on a weekend day, that's a pretty significant chunk of the American public.
All right, John Fredericks Radio Network. I want to thank Scott Rasmussen for being with us. This segment brought to you by the Job Creators Network and jobcreatorsnetwork.com. Go to scottrasmussen.com. Scott, have a great rest of your holiday weekend. Thanks for getting up early and joining us today on Friday, July 5th. Thank you, Scott. We'll see you next week.